Turmoil in Lebanon. What's the full story though? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Lebanon is going through pure chaos right now. We all saw the video of that grand explosion, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a full story arc prior to that led up to that moment, and even there, that isn't the end game. The issues that led to it are still going on today. Perhaps we are at a midpoint right now in terms of resolving the issues of Lebanon, but let's begin at the beginning to make sure we get the full scope of the current day problems that are plaguing the country. So, let's rewind time all the way back to 2019. And that's arguably where all the trouble began. At this point, thousands of people became impoverished and protests ravaged the streets as a result of that. Now, there are some contributing factors that played a role in leading to that outcome. According to the BBC, those include the following. First of all, the debt to GDP ratio of Lebanon exploded. This measures how much a country owes versus how much it produces. GDP is your national production, and your debt is how much you owe. As you can imagine, having a high ratio indicates that your country isn't making enough money or production to pay back their debt. You just aren't at a level where you can handle it. You've taken on far too much than you can pay back. Here's an example that I think makes more sense, putting it into a personal context. Let's say that you have a debt of $100,000. Maybe it's school tuition, your car loan, whatever. Now, you only make $25,000 per year. After taxes, your ratio would be 4 in that case. And whether we say it's high or low, it's comparative. If your neighbors have a ratio of 1 or 1.5 or 2, then yeah, yours is high. But if your neighbors have some of 8 and 10, then yours is low. And that's what we do in the world. Country to country comparison to see what's good and what's not. Lebanon was not good. In the personal example, we know it's not good because you can't really pay back this debt in any short span of time. You could save all of your money for 4 years and then just barely pay it off, but we know that's not possible because you have other expenses too. You have to pay for rent, you need food, there is probably going to be some entertainment in your budget, and the same is true for a country. If you can't pay back your debts in that period of time, and in fact, you're actually taking on more debt than you pay back, that means your debt's getting bigger every year, and your ability to ever pay it back is further diminishing. It's just not possible. The ratio is too large now. It would be something like you can only pay back $5,000 towards your debt every year, but the interest adds on $10,000. So you're never really reducing the principal, you're just paying off a portion of the interest, and the remainder is going to get tacked onto the debt, and next year you're going to pay more, and more and more. So you need more money, but you don't have it. That's a problem. Now, it might dawn on you that, hey, my income alone isn't enough for me to take care of my debt. Maybe I should take on more debt to pay back this debt. And hopefully the new debt has a lower interest rate or something like that that makes it more attractive. That's essentially what happened in Lebanon. At some point, Lebanon's GDP and the debt to GDP ratio ranked as the third highest in the world. Things got far out of hand. They feasibly couldn't pay it back within their own means, so they started to look outside of that. And this perpetuates a loop where you need money to cover your current debt, but because of your bad standing, ranking the third highest in the world with your debt to GDP ratio is going to cost you tremendously more. A lender isn't going to give you the same rate as they would give Canada or the US. They have far too much concerns about your ability to ever pay it back. Therefore, the risk is higher, and they expect to be compensated for that. That means the more debt you take, the more expensive it becomes, and you can pay back your old ones, but the ones you're getting now, they might actually be more than what you had before. This means in the future, you're going to need to borrow more, and you're going to need to borrow more the next year after that, and the one after that. And it's a cycle, and it will continue. Then on top of that too, you can likely expect a decline in the amount of willing investors who want to come into the country and put money into it. Because things look pretty grim. The economy isn't doing too well, and confidence in the country is falling. The economics just don't make sense there. Now, moving on to the next issue. It was the ballooning unemployment rate. Keep in mind too that these were before COVID-19 even hit. So things got much worse later. Prior to COVID, the unemployment rate was 25%. And that's pretty disastrous to have a quarter of your workforce out of luck. For comparison, before COVID, the Canadian unemployment rate was sitting at around 5%, so 5 times more in Lebanon. Now, obviously, this had numerous ripple effects that came from it for the population, such as growing poverty. In fact, about a third of the population ranked below the poverty line because nobody had work, and the government couldn't really do anything to support you because they're so indebted. Everywhere you look, it's just everyone's hands are tied. There's no money at the personal level, there's no money at the governmental level, so what do? And all of these items are connected, so jobs start tanking. Therefore, your GDP is going to fall because there are less people producing. And at the same time, because there's less production, there is less revenue for the government because taxes are going to drop. Now, that's only true if you keep your tax rate the same. You can try and increase your taxes to make more money off of a reduced supply, but we'll get to that in a second. Lebanon did try and do that and it backfired. So, as you can see, everything is falling now, and as a result, your debt ratio grows more. And as a result, borrowing gets more expensive. Money is tight, so the government can't spend on the social needs of its people, and thus poverty explodes and no one's there to help you. Everything here moves in a cyclical pattern. Now, when large swaths of people can't produce, they can't get a job, where can the government find spots to recoup some of that loss in tax revenue? Because it is pretty massive and it further stalls the recovery. There's no money to invest. They need money, but they aren't going to get it from income tax, so what do? They look towards debt primarily, and that turned out to be a massive issue because of the other loop you get trapped in of increasing interest rates and payments that are too large for you. Now, the global community recognized the turmoil, and that was made evident via the sinking currency rate, so it does get worse yet again. You get to have all of the issues I mentioned before, and at the same time, now let's add on massive inflation. The Lebanese pound, which is the official currency of the country, lost roughly 80% of its value over the span of 10 months. Let that sink in for a second. And if it doesn't make sense, we're going to explain it. But one thing that people fail to understand is that the actual numeric denomination of a country's currency is not all that important. You can have $1, 100 yen, 0.75 pounds, 1,000 rupees, and all of these have varying numbers here. 100, 1,000, 1, but what really matters though is the value you get from the currency, not the number. If you earn 1 million yen, it could be the equivalent of 100,000 Canadian dollars. The raw value, just the number, doesn't matter. What does matter though is the purchasing power. You have to understand that. In Lebanon, that purchasing power and the value of the money crashed hard. To put it into perspective, let's say you spent your life saving money for retirement. You end up accumulating 1 million Canadian dollars and you think, wow, that's great. I can live off this for the rest of my life. Even if you don't make any more money off interest, let's say you are 65 and you expect to live to 85. You can withdraw $50,000 every year, live off that, and you'll be good for 20 years. And then presumably at 85, you're going to die, hypothetically. But let's apply the Lebanon filter onto the equation now. Your savings lose 80% of their value over the short span of less than 1 year. You're going to still have 1 million in the bank. The numeric value is the same. The raw number isn't going to change here, but it doesn't matter. The purchasing power is 80% less. This means that, as it is, you really only have the equivalent of $200,000. Taking $50,000 out in equivalent terms will only last you 4 years now, versus the 20 from before, because it costs more money to buy the same things. You went from being able to sustain yourself for 20 years to just 4 now. In Lebanon, the issue is quite different. You may have gone from being able to sustain yourself for 1 week to just 10 hours. Your money is so devalued that you can only afford basic necessities for the here and now, and a day later, you can't do it anymore. Many people don't have the $1 million in the bank that we were talking about before that could buy you 4 years of time to just survive. People living paycheck to paycheck got screwed. Their money wasn't worth anything anymore. Basic necessities would bankrupt you. A loaf of bread could be worth 1 week's worth of pay. Unemployment is high. Poverty is high. The government is massively indebted. And now your personal savings and whatever you're going to earn in the future in that country's currency is just peanuts. That's economic hell. Everyone in that country ends up being put in a precarious situation because they don't know if their money's going to be worth anything the next day. And this is the issue with overspending and not being economically wise as a government. And I'm going to go off on a tangent now, but this is highly applicable to places like Canada and America. We run up our debt and we don't bat an eye. Only when the fallout occurs does it actually matter to us, but at that point, it's too late. If we don't manage our debts properly, we could easily find ourselves in a situation comparable to Lebanon. Now, America is somewhat different. They have the world standard for currency, the American dollar. There are many investments there. Even if things got grim, I still think America would be the golden boy. People would flock to it. They would see it as a buy low opportunity. With Lebanon, not so much. Nobody wants to touch it. Canada, where would it go? Probably be in the middle of that. And even having something half as bad as Lebanon is not desirable. Being fiscally responsible is a major responsibility of the government. And these days it's often overlooked. Now, there is a new type of monetary theory out there that essentially says, hey, if we encounter an issue like this, we'll just print money. We'll get the central bank to ramp up production and we'll just pour it out into the economy and make things better. And that seems like a very flawed mechanism to me because there have been cases of countries who try to do that. And as a result, hyperinflation occurs because once again, there is a loss of faith in the currency. What's the real value of it if the government's going to pump out trillions of dollars into the economy willy-nilly? There isn't something like the gold standard that ties your dollar to a material thing. It's really just paper. The value given to it is the consensus confidence we have in the currency. And if we lose that, then yes, hyperinflation could occur. Your money, because it's so diluted now, the demand is far too low given the supply, it could lose 80% of its value. We've been playing very fast and loose with what we do with our country's debt, and it could be a problem. I do think it will be a problem if it's not managed properly. To continually run a deficit every year and to not have a valid plan on paying things back, it could be a mistake, and I do get the argument that people would say to me. They would say, hey, the government situation is very different than yours. You only have a finite amount of time to pay back your debt, maybe over a 30-year period, but the government, it's indefinite. The government's going to go on for hundreds of years, and given the realities of just regular inflation, things going up by 2% every year, your debt might not mean too much to you in the future. And here's an example that highlights that. If you got a mortgage in, let's say 1990, you could probably get a good sized house for what, $100,000? And you'd pay it off over 30 years. Then let's say in 2010, where housing prices start to go up, you'd be 20 years into your mortgage and you look at it and say, hey, it's actually not a lot. I only have maybe $30,000 left on it. And I know today, given the inflation that happened, that housing is worth far more than just that, and I got a steal. Maybe that's possible. But at the same time, maybe a reality like Lebanon is also possible, where things fall apart. To not be having active discussions around these realities and to not have a plan to handle it, a plan to make sure we don't get to that point, it's a mistake in my opinion. The government is too addicted to low interest rate spending, and we may be massively mortgaging the future of Canada just so we have a little bit more comfort in the here and now. I'm not too sure it's the best bargain, but now back to the topic at hand. The question is, how did things get this bad in Lebanon? The article cites that the Lebanese central bank was wrecking their own economy by ridiculous borrowing habits. It would borrow money at above market rates so it could pay back its debt, because it was really concerned about keeping its currency in line with the American dollar, which it was pegged to. When you take money, though, at above market rates, it just costs you more. You pay down your debt over there, but now you have more debt over here. And I do assume that it was above market rate because of the economic realities there. The lenders do expect a sort of surplus for the risk they take on. If I had to guess, the central bank was doing that because they realized that if it got out to the world that they couldn't pay back their debts, the economy would crumble all that much faster. So it was really a lose-lose either way. It's either you don't pay back your debts because your economy is crippled and the rest of the world abandons you, or you take on these debts at expensive interest rates so you can finance your existing debts, but you end up getting more debt they have to pay off in the future. And that way only makes sense if you have a recovery plan. If you can take on more debt now, but in a year or 2 years it'll put you in a better place to pay everything back, then yeah. But that didn't seem to be the case for Lebanon here. Then, eventually, the government realized that borrowing wasn't the sole answer. They had to find a way to reduce their expenses. Things were just too expensive. The money wasn't there to pay for everything. So, they introduced daily power cuts to get money. They neglected their water system to save money. Healthcare decayed. They couldn't renew it. And internet infrastructure wasn't being maintained. Everything was falling apart. At this point, the people got quite frustrated. The economy was in shambles. There are now daily power outages. The water is not clean. And there was just a plethora of other unpleasant government mandates. People just didn't like the way things were going. Things weren't looking too good. So, they organized together and they started to blame the ruling elite for the chaos. They were saying that the elite were only concerned with furthering their own wealth and they neglected the needs of the people. The government wasn't there doing its role. It wasn't serving the populace. It was serving a couple of interest groups here and there based on whatever criteria they established. They weren't working for the people as a whole. I think that's fair, and based on the data, it seems to be an accurate diagnosis of the problem. Now, protests and strikes began occurring, and things got even worse after that. So out of nowhere, wildfires emerged on their mountain regions, and the government couldn't handle it. They didn't have the money, and they couldn't quell the fires. The emergency services just were vastly underfunded, and nobody was there to take care of it. So the economy's in shambles, there's fire in the mountain region, and the government's not doing anything to handle it. That sounds like a hellscape to me. People saw that and were obviously scared by the current situation. Things were looking very, very grim. Now, the government looks around at everything and they say, well, we tried borrowing money and it didn't do much for us. We tried cutting expenses and now people are mad. Perhaps we can try something else here. We didn't try increasing our revenue via taxes yet. And how do you do that? Well, we already said that people are unemployed. It can't be income tax, so maybe consumption tax. The government tried to pass new taxes on tobacco, petrol, and even WhatsApp usage, sending a message or doing a voice call on the app, which is free. Now you get taxed for it. People snapped at that point, and the government did say, okay, we take it back. We're going to cancel our plans to put these taxes on, but it was too late. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the people went off the deep end. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets and they were displaying their discontent. The prime minister actually ended up resigning at this point, but keep in mind too, Lebanon is unique. They have a prime minister and a president, so the division of power is quite divided there, but the PM was the one to resign, which further added to the chaos, and a new fellow took his place. The president appointed him. He came in and said, hey, you know what? We just can't pay these debts off. It's far too much. The previous government screwed us. So he announced that the country would default on their foreign loans. Now, the idea is you can incur some savings immediately. You don't have to pay back these loans anymore in the interest. You can take that money and put it directly towards solving your problem. The infrastructure, the healthcare, the power outages, whatever you need to do, you have some money now to handle that. But the downside here is good luck getting loans in the future at any reasonable rate. It really is a lose-lose situation once again. It's either you say, forget the debts, we're not paying them, and you tend to your country's needs, or you pay the debt, you endure a massive hardship, but you have some type of decent credit standing going to the future. By defaulting on these loans here, you can probably expect that countries and lenders, investors, whoever, aren't going to be too keen on giving Lebanon money in the future. Even if they want to pay a high premium, they just essentially declared bankruptcy at this moment. They might be willing to do it again. Once you establish that, it gets into the minds of the investors and they're going to be unwilling to give you anything. And if they do, it's going to be at a crazy premium. So foreign lending is pretty much out of the equation now. And it seemed like they had to do it though. It was definitely a rock and a hard place. In their current situation, I think it was probably the right call to essentially forego all the debt. They were screwed in various ways, and this at least could help quell the problems within their borders to some degree right now. You get to allocate money freely to where it has to go. Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but as you can probably infer from the way these stories have been going so far, things once again get even worse. Now, trouble comes when COVID-19 hits the country. People are getting sick, people are dying, people are put into lockdown, and if you thought that unemployment was bad before, these conditions just exacerbate the issue because there is nowhere to go. You're on lockdown. If you can't work from home, your job is gone. And it was already at 25% before. Now it was probably pushing closer to 50. And as I alluded to before as well, the healthcare system wasn't doing too well because the government couldn't fund it. And now you have an additional burden. It struggled tremendously. The single possible benefit to the government was that the lockdown stopped the protests for a little bit, but the conditions kept deteriorating and things got ignited once more. They were bad before and they got even worse now. And eventually, at a protest, a young man got shot by a soldier. The reports say it was a violent protest, but obviously you don't want to be doing that. You can't have your army killing civilians. That there crosses a line that should never be crossed. And that made things even more intense. If you're going to be trying to dismantle a supposed violent protest, there are ways to do that without resulting in the death of anyone. You probably shouldn't even be going there with an armed rifle. You have other things that you could use, like a riot shield, arresting the most violent people, maybe tear gas. There are things you can do that aren't going to be as heinous and egregious, but this year, you killed a young man in cold blood. And obviously, things got ignited once more. People got even more fed up. Now, finally, we get to the point where we all saw the video. The explosion occurred, and that was just tremendously disastrous for everything in the surrounding area. The latest reports indicate that at least 54 people died. Right now, they're still sifting through the rubble, finding bodies. Many thousands more were injured, and entire areas and neighborhoods were destroyed. So, the economy sucks, there's COVID-19, the government is incompetent in the best case, corrupt in the worst case, and now if you were in that area, you're either dead, severely injured, and keep in mind too, the hospitals are underfunded, they're overrun, and you probably can't get help. And in the best case, if you were in the area, you didn't get hurt, your house is now gone. It's blown to smithereens and everything there is destroyed. That's crazy. Investigations are still being conducted, trying to figure out what really happened here, but many people feel the government had a role in this. So supposedly, the origin of the explosion was this factory where they had a variety of chemicals and compounds that are typically used in things like fireworks and bombs, and somehow it got ignited. And having all of those compounds there that are highly explosive led to the disaster that you saw on video. And because people feel like the government had a role in it, people are back to protesting, and security, government security, or military forces, whatever you want to call them, are meeting the protesters with equal vigor. There are many clashes that continue to grow, and tear gas is being constantly exchanged between the soldiers and the protesters. Things aren't looking too good. Now, we get to the next question. Why is the Lebanon government having so many issues? Why can't they get their act together? The article points towards something called political sectarianism. In other words, different sects of leadership, different groups, all looking out for their own interest, a form of tribalism. Now, there are three main political units in Lebanon. There is the president, the speaker of parliament, and the prime minister. And these are all divided. The way things work in Lebanon is quite different. So, right now, the president's office is some variation of Christian, the speaker is Shia Muslim, and the PM is Sunni Muslim. Now, although things are a democracy, certain seats in the government are withheld for certain religions. They try to ensure that the religious diversity is accounted for in the government. It's a form of equality of outcome, and it seems to be a disaster here. So, the reports indicate that these different groups are accused of favoring their own tribes, their own people, and doing favors to that group to maintain their graces and power status. If you're going to be a Christian in power, you might look out for the rights and the privileges of the Christian community. And the same can be said for the Sunni or the Shia Muslim groups too. When you divide yourself like that, you fragment into identity groups, tribalism, you are inclined to view the world through that lens, and we're seeing that play out here supposedly. Instead of the holistic government looking at Lebanon as also a holistic item and regarding all the citizens, The religious groupings influence that decision making, and they're looking at their groups entirely. They're doing things to favor the Christians or the Muslims here, or their voters here, to make sure they don't lose their power, and it's a disaster. Because there are certain things that favor everyone, but not everyone equally. If someone sees a policy that isn't doing too much for their group, they might try and go astray and figure something else out. And another group will try and do that. Instead of seeing everyone as just Lebanese citizens, they're breaking it down to these granular groups here. And it's a problem. Imagine if Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, was trying to advocate only for French Canadians or only for Christians or something like that. It would be preposterous, it'd be outrageous, because we know that level of tribalism is not conducive to the good of Canada as a whole. It's actually very similar to perhaps the Bloc Québécois. They're only focused with Quebec, and that's really all they care about. They don't pay too much attention to the other provinces, and they're going to do what they can to make sure Quebec rises to the top. Now imagine if the Bloc Québécois actually ran Canada. They somehow became the majority party, or even the minority party, but they still have the PM within their group. What do you think they would do? Would they be favoring Quebec because it's in their name, the Bloc Québécois? Probably. And that would be a dramatic issue, because now the needs of the regular citizen are being undermined by the special interest groups of those in power. And that's supposedly what we're seeing from the Lebanese government. And since we're on the topic of politics, there are some other issues too that stem from supposedly, again, Iran's backing of the Shia Hezbollah movement, which is regarded as the most powerful military and political group in Lebanon. You should be aware too, this isn't a regular group, and nobody really wants to talk about it, but the military wing of Hezbollah, because they have their own army, is considered a terrorist organization in 18 countries. It's fundamentally an Islamic political entity. In other words, they adhere to a form of religious fundamentalism. Their party flag itself has a hand upholding an AK-47. Whatever you want to argue about the origins of the group, how they were started, whatever, the current facts are that Hezbollah isn't a group you want holding tremendous power within your country. And the protesters are saying that. A lot of them are in the street and they're denouncing Hezbollah. They're saying it's a terrorist organization and they don't want them having anything to do with the current government. Currently, Lebanon ranks 137th out of 180 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, so things are already pretty shady as they are. This now leads me to my final point, and that's what we can do to help. Now, to my woke activist friends who have recently fallen in love with things like petitions and forums, petitions don't do anything, especially in regard to this issue here. A corrupt government doesn't care about your online forum from the West. They don't care that you signed it. They don't care that 1,000 people signed it. They don't care that 1 million people signed it. It is irrelevant to them. Now, you may feel very good for signing it, but it doesn't amount to anything. I will say education is good, though. To learn about what's going on there, to learn about the issues with the government, to see where things went wrong, and to try and make sure that these issues don't occur elsewhere, that's a good. To try and figure out a solution that can be realistically applied to the country of Lebanon, that's good too. But back to the petitions thing, it's even arguable that legitimate governments don't care much about the online forums. That's another topic. But to think that a government like Lebanon's going to care is just outlandish. Now, what you can do if you want to go further than that, than just learning, is you can donate money. Because there is massive catastrophe there, especially for those in the area of the blast. As we said, the economic hardship is crippling, and now you may have lost your house, you may be injured, you may have even died. It's not the ideal mix of things there. So, keep in mind though, not all charities are legit. There are a lot of scams, first of all, and there's a lot of corrupt entities who will just funnel the money to the government. Many people fear that the government will dip their fingers into the pot and just take your donations and use it for whatever they want to use it for, not actually helping people. As a result, you have to be smart. And that's true whenever you give charity, whenever you make a donation. So, as you may know, Canada has a government plan to match donations to Lebanese relief, to Lebanon's relief. That's a good thing to get involved with. Other countries have similar programs too. You can also support the Lebanese or Lebanon Red Cross. I forget what they call themselves. It's one of those two, Lebanon or Lebanese Red Cross. which is regarded as one of the more legit organizations to give your money to. People believe that the money is going to an organization that's on the ground and they'll actually do something. So, based on the data, they seem to be the best one to give money to. Now, I have seen as well that they have issued a notice saying that we don't really need Lebanese pounds because they're not worth anything. If you could donate to us, preferably American dollars is the best thing to use, and I hear that. The dollar over there, or the pound they call it, is so devalued that you really can't get much for it. But the American dollar, that's the standard for the world, and it has value. Once again, it's not about the currency, it's about the buying power. Fundamentally, though, the truth here is that your charity is good, it's great, but that's not going to be the solution to the problem overall. It's going to be needing to come from the government, from within. So, as we've said, there are many issues with the government and the way it's set up, with the system. The economy was already out of control prior to COVID. Their spending has to be analyzed, the structure has to be analyzed, funding has to be given to the necessities to keep them afloat. You can't run these insane deficits every year and allow a corrupt government to profit off of that. Fiscal responsibility is a key here. The government seems to be figuring that out, but they have to actually perform now. They have to take it seriously, and they have to get the economy back into shape. The donations are needed because they are a band-aid. There is tremendous hardship right now that the government just can't handle. They need help. But the wound underneath has to be healed from the government standpoint, from within the country. We can keep putting a band-aid on it, but the wound itself has to be healed internally. The whatever white blood cells, antibiotics within the body have to get to the spot and they have to close that wound. So you won't need the bandages anymore. The humanitarian aid should get them to a stable place, hopefully. And from there, the government has to be held accountable. The people have to figure out a way to make sure the government is responsible for the things they have to be responsible for. They aren't going to take any more nonsense, the people, from the government, and that's good. I see that change here. They're all very aware of what's going on, and they're engaged. They know what they want, and they're calling for it in the streets, so that has to be supported, and hopefully it brings about the change that creates a sustainable good for the country. Now, I will keep my eyes on the ways the story develops, and I'll keep you up to date. But now, that brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, please share and leave a review. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org or on social media at perryplatform. Feel free to ask me questions or start a conversation online. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.